Close your eyes for a second and picture this. 4 women standing in the glow of a single candle, their shadows stretching like demons across the stone walls of a Pennsylvania farmhouse. The air is so still that you can hear the wax drip onto the table. Outside, the October wind rattles the shutters as if the night itself wants to eavesdrop. One by one, they speak, not in fear, not in prayer, but in agreement. Their father's body isn't even cold in the ground, and already they are plotting death. You weren't supposed to know this story. The records don't tell it, the court transcripts don't dare to suggest it, and history has tried its best to bury it. But here it is. 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 funerals, and a trail of bodies that carved their name into Lancaster County's most cursed legend. They were Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah Brennan, Irish daughters of a man who spent his life building an empire of soil, cattle, and stone. He left them 847 acres of the most valuable farmland in Pennsylvania, but no sons to inherit it. And in 1836, that was a death sentence for a dynasty. By law, the land had to be divided. 4 pieces, 4 futures, 4 fragments. To men in power, this was justice. To the Brennan sisters, this was annihilation. They had been raised on a single, unbreakable truth. Land is life, and to lose the land is to lose your bloodline. And so, on a frost-covered night with grief still raw in their throats, they decided on something far darker than inheritance negotiations. What followed was not the story of survival Lancaster County expected. It was the quiet birth of a conspiracy so precise, so calculated, that even the coroner would swear every death was an accident. But they weren't accidents, not one. Each man who entered that stone farmhouse entered what was, in truth, a beautiful silent trap. This is the story no one told you. The Kins. It's a story that changes a man once he hears it. You will not leave this the same person you were before, and it all begins with a single whisper. Men die, sisters. Husbands die, and widows inherit everything. The morning after that candle-lit pact, Lancaster County looked the same. The barns still steamed with the breath of cattle, the fields still glistened with frost, and the church bells still called the faithful to prayer. But inside the Brennan farmhouse, something had shifted. The 4 sisters moved through the house like generals after a war council. No one spoke of the conversation from the night before, yet every glance, every gesture carried the weight of a shared secret. Bridget, the eldest, assumed command as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. She was no longer just a daughter grieving her father, she was a strategist. She began drawing up ledgers, not just of the farm's accounts, but of Lancaster County's most eligible men. Lawyers, bankers, judges, landowners, each name carefully listed, each man evaluated like livestock. Wealth, status, influence, weaknesses. Catherine became the watcher. She attended church socials and Sunday markets, not to gossip, but to observe. She studied how men reacted to flattery, who drank too much, who boasted of their fortunes, who had no heirs to challenge a widow's inheritance. She reported back with the precision of a spy. Margaret, beautiful and almost angelic, was the lure. She practiced her smiles in the mirror until they were perfect. She learned which shade of ribbon made her eyes seem bluer, which tone of voice made men lean closer. Sarah, the youngest, became the actress. She could shift from innocent sister to dutiful daughter to playful flirtation with such ease that no one questioned her sincerity. But make no mistake, what they were building was not a romantic pursuit. It was a campaign, and the first target was clear. Thomas Hennessy, the county's most prominent attorney, a widower, wealthy, childless, deeply Catholic, which meant he would find Bridget's quiet piety irresistible. Most importantly, he could fix what the law had broken. He could create the trust that would keep the land whole. Bridget's courtship was swift, elegant, and devastating. Within 2 months of meeting her, Hennessy was convinced that Providence had delivered him a second chance at happiness. What he didn't know was that Providence had nothing to do with it. By December, he was married. By March, he would be dead. This is where the line between tragedy and murder begins to blur, and where the Brennan sisters' plan takes its first blood sacrifice. March 15th, 1838. The day Thomas Hennessy would die began like any other, at least to those who weren't watching closely. The air was thick with fog, the kind that swallows the world whole and makes every sound feel closer than it should be. The Brennan farmhouse smelled of strong coffee and wood smoke, but there was a sharpness to the silence, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone in the room knows something is about to happen. Hennessy sat at the breakfast table reading a letter from Philadelphia. The opportunity was too good to ignore. An offer to buy into a thriving law practice in the city, a chance to step out of Lancaster County and into the political arena he'd always dreamed of. He looked across the table at his wife, expecting her to be proud. Instead, Bridget didn't look up from her bowl. "We're not leaving," she said flatly. "This is our future, Bridget, a chance to build something greater." "Our future is here," she said, her voice cutting through the steam rising from her porridge. "This land, this farm, my sisters, we don't leave." Hennessy felt something cold slide through him. He had always admired Bridget's devotion to her family, but now it felt like a wall between them. The argument sharpened. Neighbors later said they heard voices through the fog, low, sharp, then sigh, Lentz. When Hennessy left the house, his mare was already restless, pawing the ground. He mounted anyway. The fog clung to him as he rode toward town. Somewhere behind him, a stone struck against another stone, a sound so faint it might have been nothing at all. The mare reared. Hennessy grabbed for the reins, but the world tilted violently. Hours later, the horse returned to the farmhouse alone. Its flanks were lathered, its eyes wild. Bridget organized a search party with practiced calm, her voice steady, her face pale. They found Hennessy's body half a mile down the road, his neck broken, his chest bruised. The coroner called it a tragic fall. The town mourned. The funeral was grand, dignified. Bridget wore black and wept just enough to be believed, but behind closed doors the sisters gathered in the kitchen again. No words were spoken. None were needed. The plan had worked. The farm was safe, for now. One husband gone, 3 more to go. After the funeral, Lancaster County whispered about Bridget Brennan's misfortune, but no one dared suggest anything darker. Tragedy was common enough in rural Pennsylvania. A man thrown from his horse on a foggy morning. Sad, yes. Suspicious? No. If anything, the community rallied around Bridget. Widows in black were meant to inspire sympathy, not fear. But inside the stone farmhouse, the atmosphere had changed. The sisters had tasted power, real power, the kind that comes not from prayers but from action. They had bent fate to their will and discovered that the world did not punish them for it. No thunderbolt from heaven struck them down. No sheriff rode up to the farm with questions. The silence after Hennessy's death was almost intoxicating. Bridget moved quickly to secure the farm's legal status, using the very documents her husband had signed to consolidate the property into a trust that now legally belonged to the sisters. There was no debate, no argument. What the law had threatened to divide, death had made whole. But the farm needed more than legal papers to survive. It needed money, taxes, livestock, seed for the next season. And so Catherine, with her sharp eyes and sharper instincts, turned her attention to the next piece of the puzzle. Hamilton Crawford, Lancaster County's wealthiest banker. Crawford was not a man easily swayed. He was disciplined, methodical, a widower of 3 years who had buried his grief in ledgers and accounts. But Catherine knew how to speak his language. She approached him first under the guise of business, discussing tax liabilities and estate transfers. Then she let him see her softer side, her concern for her sisters, her worry for the farm's future, her vulnerability as a woman in a world that did not forgive widows. Soon, Crawford was spending more time at the farmhouse. He lingered after dinner, telling stories of the early days of the bank, laughing more than anyone had heard him laugh since his wife's death. Catherine never rushed him. She let him come closer, day by day, until he believed he had discovered her, rather than been led to her. By autumn of 1838, Catherine was wearing his ring. By winter, he was living in the farmhouse. And as the snow fell over Lancaster County that year, the sisters began preparing for the second death. This one would need to be cleaner, quieter, and far more convincing. The first had been a tragedy. The second had to look like fate itself had chosen to strike twice. Hamilton Crawford was not a fool. He had built a banking empire by spotting patterns, and as the weeks passed in the Brennan farmhouse, he began to sense one forming around him. At first it was subtle, moments that made him pause but not speak, the sisters' glances at one another when he mentioned traveling to Philadelphia on business. The way Bridget's tone sharpened whenever he suggested investing in land beyond the farm. He wrote in his leather-bound journal later to burn. At night, by the light of a single candle as Catherine slept beside him. "I cannot shake the feeling that I am being managed," one entry read. "Every suggestion I make is turned aside. The farm is their world, and I am only tolerated as long as I remain its servant. Bridget runs this house like a general. There are moments when even Catherine feels like an accomplice to something I cannot name." By January, his entries had turned darker. "Dreamt last night that I was standing on a frozen pond and the ice began to crack beneath me. The sisters were standing on the bank, watching. They did not call out. They did not move. I woke drenched in sweat." The winter that year was brutal, the kind that turned rivers into mirrors and left the landscape in a deathly silence. One morning, Crawford announced he was going to check the lower pasture where the creek had frozen solid. Catherine insisted on accompanying him, her voice too casual. Bridget said nothing, merely handed him his gloves. The sky was pale, the air sharp enough to sting as they walked down to the creek. The surface of the ice glimmered under the weak sunlight. Crawford bent to examine where the water had bubbled up and frozen again. That was when Catherine knelt beside him, her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Be careful, Hamilton," she said softly. The next moment would later be retold in hushed voices. A crack, a shout, a splash. The banker's body thrashing in the black water as the ice gave way beneath him. Catherine's scream carrying across the field as Bridget and Sarah came running from the farmhouse. By the time they pulled him from the water, Crawford was gone. His face was blue, his limbs stiff. Lancaster County mourned again. 2 husbands dead in 2 years. People said the Brennan sisters were cursed. The sisters knew better. 2 funerals in 2 years was enough to make Lancaster County uneasy. He began crossing themselves when they passed the Brennan farm. Some said the land was cursed, that the sisters were paying for some ancestral sin. Others whispered that the sisters themselves were the curse, that death followed them like a shadow. But no one dared say it too loudly. The Brennan name still carried weight, and Bridget carried herself like a woman untouchable. At Crawford's funeral, she stood ramrod straight, her face a mask of perfect grief, her black veil hiding any trace of satisfaction. Catherine, pale and trembling, was the picture of a devastated widow. It was a performance so convincing that even the coroner, who had seen the body pulled from the ice, muttered that no one could fake tears like that. Behind the farmhouse walls, however, the sisters spoke plainly. Crawford's death had secured enough money to keep the farm not just alive but thriving. New equipment was purchased, more cattle were brought in. For the first time since their father's death, the land felt secure. But Bridget was not satisfied. The trust could still be challenged in court by distant cousins, and if the wrong man married into the family, the entire estate could be lost. She believed there was only one way to make the farm untouchable. They needed a political shield. This time it would be Margaret's turn. Sweet, soft-spoken Margaret, whose beauty had always been remarked upon. She was the perfect weapon for the next target. Elijah Blackwell, a rising state legislator with ambitions that stretched all the way to Harrisburg. He was charismatic, charming, and, most importantly, eager to align himself with one of Lancaster's most prominent families. Margaret was nervous at first. Unlike Bridget or Catherine, she had always been gentle, hesitant to wield her looks as a weapon. But Bridget reassured her, coaching her on how to catch Elijah's attention at church gatherings, how to let him think every idea was his own, how to laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. Soon, Elijah was calling on the farm regularly. He brought books, wine, and talk of politics. Margaret began to blush at his compliments without even thinking about it. Somewhere deep inside her, a war began to rage. She was falling for him, and she knew what that meant. The sisters' plan would not allow for love. Margaret had never kept secrets from her sisters before. They had grown up together in the same narrow beds, whispering under quilts, sharing every fear and every hope. But Elijah Blackwell changed that. He brought something into Margaret's life she had almost forgotten existed: gentleness. While Bridget's world was made of hard edges and Catherine's of sharp glances, Elijah was warmth. He read to her in the evenings, his voice low, patient, melodic. He asked her opinions on politics as if they mattered, as if her thoughts could shape the world beyond Lancaster County. But every moment with him came with a shadow. At night, when she returned to the farmhouse kitchen, Bridget was waiting. "Did he mention the trust?" Bridget would ask. "Did he speak of marriage?" Catherine would press. It became unbearable, two worlds pulling her in opposite directions. In her journal, Margaret wrote, "I am torn in two. When I sit with Elijah, I see a future that is mine alone. But when I sit with my sisters, I feel the weight of generations." Bridget speaks of duty as if it were scripture. She says the land must be protected at any cost. But is the cost to be my soul? Elijah, for his part, was patient. He spoke often of the future, of the children they might have, of a house in Harrisburg where he could host fellow legislators. He promised her that one day she would not have to worry about taxes or farm accounts, that she could live in comfort, surrounded by beauty. But Margaret could feel the storm building. Bridget was growing impatient. Each week that passed without a formal engagement was, to her, a risk. She began to hint more strongly, reminding Margaret what was at stake. "This isn't just about you," Bridget said one night, her eyes cold as a paved auberge, the stone walls around them. "If you falter now, everything we've done will be for nothing. Hamilton drowned for this farm. Hennessy broke his neck for it. Are you going to throw that away because of a man's smile?" Margaret went to bed that night with tears on her pillow. She could still feel Elijah's hand in hers, warm and safe. She could still hear Bridget's words, sharp and merciless. And in the darkness of that room, Margaret realized something that made her blood run cold. Soon, she would have to choose whether Elijah lived or died. The night Margaret made her choice, the air in the farmhouse felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The kitchen fire burned low, casting the sisters in flickering gold and shadow. Bridget stood by the table with her arms folded. Catherine sat with her hands clasped, and Sarah, silent, watchful, leaned against the doorway. "You know what has to be done," Bridget said. Margaret didn't answer. Her hands twisted in her lap, pale against her dark skirts. She could still smell Elijah's cologne on her shawl. She could still feel the warmth of his lips on her cheek from earlier that evening. "Margaret," Bridget's voice was firm but not unkind, "this is not just about you. This is about the land, about Father's name, about all of us. If you let him marry you and take you away to Harrisburg, this farm dies, everything dies." Margaret looked up sharply. "Does it have to be this way? Couldn't we find another way?" Catherine's voice was soft, almost pitying. "There is no other way. You know that." The silence stretched until Margaret could feel her own pulse in her throat. Finally she nodded, her face white. "When?" Bridget allowed the faintest flicker of relief to cross her face. "Soon. He's going to take you to the river for a walk this Sunday, isn't he? You'll keep him there until dusk. Sarah and he'll take care of the rest." Margaret felt her stomach twist. She wanted to scream, to run to Elijah and warn him, to throw herself into his arms and beg him to take her away that very night. But something stronger held her in that kitchen. The invisible weight of her sister's eyes, the unspoken command that had ruled her life since childhood. When Sunday came, the river was still half frozen, patches of thin ice gleaming under a low winter sun. Elijah was laughing as he skipped stones across the water, his breath rising in white clouds. Margaret smiled when she was supposed to, laughed when she was supposed to, even leaned her head on his shoulder. But inside, she was counting heartbeats, listening for the distant crunch of boots on snow that meant her sisters had arrived. When the sound finally came, it was as quiet as a prayer. Elijah never saw them coming. The snow along the riverbank muffled everything except the sound of his own voice, warm and bright as he told Margaret about the house he'd found in Harrisburg. "It has a big garden," he said, skipping another stone across the black water. "You could plant anything you wanted, roses, peonies, even apple trees. You'd love it there." Margaret's throat tightened. "It sounds beautiful," she whispered. Behind them the sound came, a sharp, deliberate crack of a branch underfoot. Elijah turned, surprised. Bridget and Sarah emerged from the trees, their faces calm, their dark cloaks blending with the shadows. "Good afternoon, Elijah," Bridget said smoothly. "We thought we'd join you." He smiled politely, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Of course, we were just—" It happened quickly, too quickly for Margaret to stop. Bridget's gloved hand closed over Elijah's shoulder, almost gently. Sarah moved behind him, her face expressionless. In one fluid motion, they shoved him toward the bank. The ice, thin from tears, he last thaw, cracked like glass. Elijah plunged into the water with a cry that turned into a choking gasp as the river swallowed him. Margaret's scream tore through the still air. She dropped to her knees on the bank, reaching toward him, her hands shaking violently. "Elijah!" But Bridget's voice was cold, commanding, "Don't!" Elijah thrashed in the dark water, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his fingers clawing at the jagged ice. For a moment Margaret thought he might pull himself out, and then the ice gave way further, dragging him under. The river closed over his head. The only sound was Margaret's sobbing, ragged and raw. She sank to the snow, her body shaking, while Bridget stood over her like a sentinel. Sarah reached down, pulling Margaret to her feet. "It's done," Bridget said, her voice flat. "We go home." Margaret followed them back through the trees, her skirts dragging through the snow, her face streaked with tears. She didn't look back. She couldn't. By the time the search party found Elijah's body downstream 2 days later, the sisters were ready. They wept with the town, accepted condolences, spoke of God's mysterious will. But Margaret was never the same. The farmhouse that had once been her refuge now felt like a prison, and every night she heard Elijah's voice calling from under the ice. The farmhouse was quiet in the weeks after Elijah's death, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that pressed on the lungs, that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a warning. Margaret barely ate. She barely slept. Her once bright face had gone pale and hollow, her hands trembling whenever she touched the shawl Elijah had given her. At night, when the others slept, she would stand barefoot in the snow outside the barn, staring toward the river as if she could will him back from the black water. Bridget noticed. One evening, she found Margaret sitting in the kitchen with a Bible open in front of her, though her eyes weren't moving across the page. "You have to stop this," Bridget said quietly. Margaret didn't look up. "Do you ever think about them?" "Who?" "Hennessy, Crawford, Elijah." Her voice cracked on his name. "Do you ever think about what we did?" Bridget's face hardened. "We did what we had to do." "You mean what you decided we had to do?" Margaret's eyes finally met hers, sharp and wet with fury. "I loved him, Bridget. Do you understand that? I loved him. And you drowned him like he was a stray dog." Bridget's jaw tightened. "You think I wanted this? You think I take pleasure in it? Every choice we have made has been to protect this farm, to protect you." Margaret slammed the Bible shut so hard the candle flame flickered. "Protect me? You've turned me into a murderer." The sound woke Catherine and Sarah, who appeared in the doorway, their faces pale. The four sisters stood in the dim kitchen, the tension so thick it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Bridget's voice was low but sharp. "If you break now, Margaret, everything we've done will be for nothing. Do you want to see our land carved apart? Do you want to see strangers living in Father's house? Because that's what will happen if you run to the sheriff with your conscience." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, her chest heaving. Then she turned and fled up the stairs, her sobs echoing through the stone halls. That night, for the first time since their pact, the sisters slept apart, each in her own bed, listening to the wind outside, wondering if Margaret might betray them all. Margaret lasted barely a fortnight before the silence became unbearable. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to whisper at her, the shadows lengthening at night until she could swear she saw Elijah's face in the corners of the room. She stopped eating altogether, stopped speaking to Bridget, and spent her days wandering the edge of the property like a restless ghost. Then, one bitterly cold morning, she wrapped her C's in her black shawl and walked straight into town. Catherine saw her leave from the upstairs window and felt her stomach turn to ice. She called for Bridget, and soon, the two of them were pulling on their cloaks, following Margaret at a distance down the snow-packed road. Margaret's destination made Bridget's heart hammer in her chest, Elijah Blackwell's family home. The Blackwells were already suspicious. 3 deaths linked to the same family in less than 3 years had not gone unnoticed. They welcomed Margaret into the house with kindness, seating her by the fire, pressing hot tea into her frozen hands. "It was an accident," she told them, her voice hollow. "The ice gave way. There was nothing I could do." But the more they asked about that night, the closer she came to breaking. Her hands trembled around the teacup, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Bridget and Catherine arrived just as Margaret's voice caught on the words, "It wasn't supposed to—" "Margaret!" Bridget's voice cut through the room like a blade. Margaret froze, turning toward her sisters with wide, guilty eyes. The Blackwells glanced between them, uneasy. Bridget's smile was perfect, warm, apologetic, the kind that left no room for argument. "Forgive us," she said smoothly. "Margaret hasn't been herself since Elijah's passing. We worry about her, you see. The grief." The Blackwells nodded slowly, reluctant to press further. Bridget guided Margaret out of the house with a firm hand, her grip on her sister's arm leaving red marks in the skin. They didn't speak on the walk home, but when the farmhouse door closed behind them, Bridget spun her around, her voice low and deadly calm. "You nearly ruined everything today," she hissed. "If you ever put us in that position again, Margaret, I swear to God." But Margaret's tears were gone. Her face was hard now, set in a mask of cold resolve. "Maybe everything should be ruined," she said softly. "Maybe we deserve it." For the first time, Bridget felt something she hadn't felt since the night of their father's death. Fear. A farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a powder keg, waiting for a single spark. Margaret spoke little in the days after her near confession, but when she did speak, her words had an edge that sliced through the air. She no longer deferred to Bridget's orders, no longer softened her tone around Catherine and Sarah. At the dinner table, she let her silence speak for her, refusing to bow her head when Bridget said grace. One night, the tension snapped. Bridget was tallying the farm's accounts by lamplight when Margaret came in from the barn, her skirts dusted with hay. She stood in the doorway, her voice low and trembling. "I'm leaving," she said. Bridget looked up slowly. "Leaving where?" "Anywhere but here. I can't stay in this house another day." Bridget's pen stopped mid-stroke. "You think you can just walk away, after everything we've done to keep this farm, after everything we've done for you?" Margaret stepped into the room, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't do it for me, Bridget. You did it for yourself. You love this land more than you love any of us, more than you loved Father, more than I loved Elijah." The words landed like blows. For a moment, Bridget said nothing. Then she rose to her feet, her voice like iron. "You don't get to walk away, not now, not ever. You carry this with us, Margaret, whether you want to or not." Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Stop," she whispered. "Both of you." But the damage was done. Margaret backed toward the stairs, her jaw set. "You can chain me to this farm if you want, Bridget. You can watch me every hour of the day, but you can't make me stay quiet forever. One day I'm going to tell someone what we did, and when that day comes, I hope you're ready to lose everything." She turned and fled up the stairs, leaving Bridget standing in the lamplight, her fists clenched. For the first time, the sisters sat apart that night. Bridget at the kitchen table, Catherine pacing the floor, Sarah silently watching them both. They all knew it now. The greatest danger wasn't outside the farmhouse walls. It was inside them, wearing Margaret's face. That night, Bridget did not sleep. She sat in Father's chair by the dying fire, staring into the embers until her eyes burned. Catherine eventually drifted upstairs, but Sarah stayed near the kitchen door, watching her eldest sister's profile, lit in flickering orange. Bridget's jaw was set, her hands clenched in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft Sarah almost didn't hear. "She's going to ruin everything." Sarah didn't answer right away. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "She's grieving, Bridget. She doesn't mean what she says." Bridget turned her head, her eyes sharp. "Don't lie to me. You heard her. She's thinking about telling someone. Maybe the sheriff, maybe Elijah's family, maybe a priest." Sarah swallowed hard. "She wouldn't." "Yes, she would." Bridget stood suddenly, pacing the kitchen. "She's not like us. She was never as strong. She's always been soft, too trusting, too willing to believe the world will forgive her. But the world doesn't forgive women like us, Sarah. It buries us. Or worse." Sarah hesitated. "What are you saying?" Bridget stopped pacing. The firelight carved her face into something almost unrecognizable, something hard and dangerous. "I'm saying we can't let her talk. Not to anyone, not ever." Sarah felt her stomach twist. "You mean?" Bridget nodded once, decisive. "We finish what we started. We keep the farm whole, even if it means keeping it without her." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Bridget, she's our sister." "She's a threat," Bridget snapped. "And threats are dealt with." For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire. Sarah's face was pale, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words she dared not speak. When she finally found her voice, it was little more than a whisper. "If Catherine hears you say this—" "She won't," Bridget said, her tone flat. "Not until it's done." Upstairs, Margaret stirred in her bed, waking from a restless dream. She thought she heard voices below, low and urgent, but by the time she crept to the top of the stairs, the kitchen was silent again. She stood there in the dark, heart pounding, suddenly certain that the farmhouse was no longer just dangerous for her soul. It might soon be dangerous for her life. Catherine lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling while the wind moaned around the farmhouse. Bridget's words echoed in her head like a hammer striking iron. "We finish what we started." The thought of harming Margaret made her stomach twist until she nearly retched. She loved her younger sister, loved her laughter, her gentleness, the way she hummed to herself when she worked in the garden. Catherine still remembered the day Margaret was born, the tiny, squalling thing placed in their mother's arms, and she had sworn even as a child to protect her. But Bridget was right about one thing. Margaret was dangerous now. Her grief had made her reckless. She might confess to anyone at any time, and if she did, everything they had sacrificed would mean nothing. By dawn, Catherine rose from bed, her decision still unformed but heavy on her chest. She found Margaret in the barn, feeding the chickens, her face pale and tired. "You didn't eat supper?" Catherine said softly. "I wasn't hungry." Margaret didn't look up. "Margaret?" Catherine hesitated, then stepped closer. "You can't keep fighting with Bridget like this. You're tearing us apart." Margaret spun on her, her eyes blazing. "Bridget is tearing us apart. She thinks she's God, deciding who lives and who dies, first Crawford, then Hennessy, then Elijah, and if she has her way—" Margaret's voice broke, but she forced herself to keep going. "If she has her way, there will be more." Catherine felt her heart pound. Margaret didn't know how close to the truth she was. "You have to leave," Catherine whispered suddenly, shocking herself with the words. Margaret blinked. "What?" "Go to the next town. Take the money you've saved. Go anywhere Bridget can't find you." Margaret's face softened for the first time in weeks. You'd help me? Catherine nodded, though her throat felt tight. But you have to go soon. Before Bridget, before she... Margaret didn't need her to finish the sentence. She set down the feed bucket, her hands trembling. Tonight, she said. I'll go tonight. Catherine's relief was short-lived. When she stepped back into the house, Bridget was waiting for her by the kitchen door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Where were you? Bridget asked. Feeding the chickens, Catherine lied. Bridget studied her face for a long, tense moment. Then she nodded slowly. Good. We'll need them fattened soon. Catherine turned away so Bridget wouldn't see the guilt written across her face. Tonight, everything would change. The sun set blood-red behind the trees, and with it came a terrible stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as darkness crept over the farmhouse. Catherine moved through the house in silence, her heart hammering with every step. She had slipped a small bundle of food, a flask of water, and the few coins she could spare into a satchel she kept hidden under her shawl. Every time Bridget's footsteps passed behind her, she felt the skin on her neck prickle. Margaret stayed in the barn after supper, waiting for Catherine's signal. She had braided her hair tight, pulled on her warmest cloak, and laced her boots until her fingers ached. She kept glancing toward the horizon where the road disappeared into the woods, imagining herself walking it, imagining herself free. But Bridget was watching. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly, her eyes fixed on the window as if she could see straight through the night. Sarah sat nearby, silent and pale, chewing her lip until it bled. When Catherine finally stood to fetch water from the well, Bridget rose too. I'll go with you, she said softly. Catherine froze. That's not necessary. Bridget tilted her head, smiling faintly. I insist. The walk to the well felt endless. The snow crunched under their boots, loud as rifle shots. Catherine gripped the satchel beneath her cloak, praying Bridget couldn't hear the clink of coins inside. Halfway there, Bridget stopped walking. You're helping her, aren't you? Catherine's blood went cold. Bridget's voice was calm, almost gentle. You think I don't see it? The way you look at her, the way you've been moving food around, you're planning to let her run. Catherine swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay level. If she stays, she'll go mad. If she goes, maybe she'll find peace. Peace? Bridget's smile sharpened. There's no peace for traitors. If she talks, we hang. All of us. She won't talk. Catherine's voice cracked. Bridget stepped closer, her face inches from her sister's. She will, sooner or later, and when she does, I'll be ready. She turned back toward the house, her skirts sweeping the snow. Catherine stood frozen by the well, her breath clouding in the air, knowing the truth with a sick certainty. Bridget wasn't just suspicious anymore, she was planning something. And if Catherine didn't act tonight, Margaret might not live to see morning. Catherine waited until the house went still before moving. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening as she crept to the barn, clutching the satchel under her cloak. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the night was black enough to swallow her whole. Margaret was already waiting by the door, her breath fogging in the cold air. Is it time? She whispered. Yes, Catherine said, her voice tight. We have to go now. Could take a single step. The barn door slammed shut behind them. Bridget stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, her face carved from shadow and firelight. Sarah hovered just behind her, pale and shaking. Going somewhere? Bridget's voice was calm, almost too calm. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Bridget! Don't! Bridget snapped. She stepped inside, setting the lantern on a beam so the light swung wildly across the walls. You were really going to sneak away in the night? Leave your family to hang while you save yourself? It's not like that. Margaret's voice rose. I can't live like this anymore. I can't live with what we've done. Then maybe you shouldn't live at all. The words fell like a blade. Catherine stepped between them, her arms spread. No, Bridget, this ends tonight. We've buried enough. If you do this, there's no going back. Bridget's jaw tightened. There's already no going back. We chose this path the night we put Crawford in the ground. Margaret's tears streamed hot down her face, but she didn't move. "If you kill me, Bridget, you'll have to kill Catherine too. She's the one who gave me the satchel. She's the one who told me to run." Bridget's head turned sharply toward Catherine, betrayal flashing in her eyes. For a long, terrible moment, the barn was silent except for the sound of the swinging lantern chain. Then Sarah spoke, her voice small but steady. "We can't keep doing this." Bridget stared at her youngest sister in disbelief. "You think you can just walk away?" Bridget said, her voice rising. "You think we can go back to being innocent? We are not innocent, and if we let Margaret go, she'll drag us all to the gallows." "Or maybe," Catherine said quietly, "she'll set us free." Bridget's hands trembled, and for the first time, she looked less like the unbreakable pillar that had held them together, and more like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. The four sisters stood there in the flickering light, the air between them charged and fragile, knowing that before the night was over, someone would be leaving the barn, either on foot or in a shroud. For a moment, no one moved. The barn was so quiet they could hear the hiss of the lantern flame. Then Bridget stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her boots crunching in the straw. "You think you can betray me and just walk away?" she said, her voice trembling now with rage. "You think I've carried this farm, buried those men, kept this family together just so you can undo it all?" Catherine didn't flinch. "You carried us, Bridget. Yes, but you carried us into darkness. And now you want to drag Margaret down with you. I won't let you." Bridget's hand shot out, grabbing the wooden handle of a pitchfork leaning against the wall. Margaret gasped and backed away, but Catherine stood her ground. "Bridget," Catherine said, her voice low and firm, "if you're going to do this, you'll have to go through me." The sisters locked eyes, years of buried anger and grief boiling up in that single look. Bridget's knuckles whitened on the pitchfork handle. "Get out of my way," she said. "No." The silence shattered as Bridget lunged. Catherine caught the handle, the two of them wrestling for control in a violent, breathless struggle. The lantern swung wildly, throwing huge, jerking shadows across the walls. "Stop!" Sarah cried, rushing forward, but Bridget's shoulder slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Margaret screamed, grabbing a shovel from the corner and swinging it clumsily. It struck the pitchfork handle, sending it clattering to the floor. Bridget whirled on Margaret, her face a mask of fury, and for a terrible second it looked as though she might grab the pitchfork again, this time to finish what she started. But Catherine moved faster. She shoved Bridget hard, sending her stumbling back into the wall. The lantern chain snapped, the light crashing to the ground. Flames licked at the dry straw almost instantly. All four sisters froze, staring at the fire as it spread across the barn floor, the smoke already curling upward into the rafters. For the first time since the night of their first killing, Bridget looked afraid. "We have to get out," Sarah shouted, scrambling to her feet, but Margaret didn't move. She stood staring at Bridget through the rising smoke, her chest heaving, as though deciding whether to run or to finally let the fire take them all. The fire caught like it had been waiting for this moment. Dry straw became kindling, and in seconds the flames roared up the walls, turning the barn into a furnace. The horses screamed and thrashed against their stalls. Smoke filled the air, searing their throats. Catherine grabbed Margaret's arm. "We have to go." But Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her face lit orange by the flames. "Let it burn," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Margaret." Bridget shoved past them both, racing to unbar the stalls. "Help me," she shouted. "If the barn goes, we lose the livestock, we lose everything." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before running to help, coughing against the thickening smoke. Catherine dragged Margaret toward the door, but Margaret dug in her heels. "Don't you see?" Margaret cried over the roar of the fire. "This is our chance. Let it all burn. Let the farm die with our sins." Catherine's heart twisted, because a part of her wanted to agree. But the sight of Sarah struggling with the panicked horses snapped her back. She yanked Margaret hard toward the door. "Not like this!" Catherine screamed. Bridget hauled the last stall door open and slapped the horse's flank, sending it bolting into the snow. Her face was streaked with soot, Her hair singed, but there was no mistaking the fury in her eyes as she turned back to her sisters. "Get her out!" she shouted at Catherine. They stumbled into the night just as the barn roof gave a groaning crack and collapsed inward, sending a plume of sparks spiraling into the sky. The four sisters stood, odd in the snow, panting, their faces lit by the burning ruin behind them. Bridget turned to Margaret, her voice shaking with rage and smoke. "You wanted this," she said. "You wanted to see it all destroyed." Margaret stared back, tears streaming down her soot-blackened face. Better the barn than me. For a long, horrible moment it seemed Bridget might strike her down right there in the snow. But Catherine stepped between them, her arms spread wide. "No more," Catherine said, her voice raw. "Do you hear me? No more blood. No more graves. Whatever happens next, it ends tonight." The flames behind them devoured what remained of the barn, the roar of the fire, the only witness to the words that hung in the freezing air. Bridget didn't answer. She just turned away, staring into the fire as if it might tell her what to do next. By morning, the barn was nothing but a smoldering skeleton, black timbers jutting out of the snow like broken ribs. The air still reeked of wet ash and scorched hay. The sisters stood in the yard, their faces pale in the cold light of dawn. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than the smoke that still hung low over the fields. Bridget's eyes swept over the ruin, calculating what they had lost. Half their winter feed was gone. The barn would take months to rebuild. The livestock that had bolted into the night now had to be found before they froze or were taken by wolves, but worse than the loss was the betrayal. Bridget turned slowly to Margaret, who stood apart from the others, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Look at what you've done," Bridget said quietly. Margaret didn't flinch. "I didn't light the fire." "You may as well have." Bridget's voice was flat, but her eyes blazed. "You hesitated. You wanted it to burn. You wanted us to burn." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "Yes," she said. "I did. And for a moment I almost hoped it would take you with it." The words landed like a slap. Catherine stepped forward quickly, putting herself between them, before Bridget could respond. "Enough," she said sharply. "We saved what we could. We're still alive, that's what matters." Bridget's gaze stayed locked on Margaret, her jaw tight. "She's not going anywhere now," Bridget said at last. "She stays in the house. No more wandering off. No more trips into town. I'll keep the keys to the storehouse and the money box." Margaret's face twisted. "You mean to keep me prisoner?" Bridget didn't blink. "If that's what it takes." Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice small but firm. "We can't keep her locked up like an animal." Bridget turned on her youngest sister, her voice sharp. "You think I like this? You think I want to guard my own blood like a criminal? But we have no choice. One wrong word from her and everything we've done will come out." Margaret met Bridget's glare without fear. "Maybe it should." The wind howled through the empty yard, carrying the smell of smoke with it. The sisters stood facing one another like enemies instead of kin, the fire's ashes between them like a line drawn in the snow. For the first time, Catherine wondered if their family could survive the winter, not just the cold, but the weight of the secrets pressing down on them all. Bridget kept her word. By the end of the day, the storehouse key was tied to her belt, and the money box was hidden under the floorboards of her room. Margaret was forbidden to leave the house without Bridget or Catherine beside her. Even the barnyard, what was left of it, was off limits. It was a punishment wrapped in the language of protection. For the first few days, Margaret obeyed in silence, but it was not submission. She moved through the house like a ghost, her presence filling the rooms with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Catherine watched helplessly as her sisters circled each other, waiting for one to strike. Bridget sat at the table ever, by night, her ledger open, her jaw set like stone. Margaret sat across from her, staring down at her plate until the food went cold. Sarah tried to keep the peace, but even she was fraying. One night she burst into tears at supper, slamming her spoon down. "We can't live like this," she cried. "You're turning this house into a prison." Bridget's eyes snapped to her youngest sister. "It's a prison because Margaret made it one." Margaret's voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a knife. "No. This house became a prison the night we buried Father." Bridget's hand slammed down on the table hard enough to rattle the dishes. "Don't you dare speak his name like that." Margaret didn't look away. "Why not? Isn't that what this is all about? Keeping his farm, keeping his name, keeping a promise none of us agreed to? How many graves have we filled in his name, Bridget? How many more before you're satisfied?" The kitchen went silent except for the sound of the fire popping in the hearth. Bridget stood slowly, her chair scraping across the floor. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice low. "You think you can break me by talking like this. But I am not the one who will break, Margaret. You are." That night, Catherine found Margaret sitting by the window in their shared room, her face lit by moonlight. "She means it," Margaret whispered. "She'll keep me here until I lose my mind." Catherine knelt beside her, taking her hand. "Then we can't wait. The first chance we get, I'll help you run again. But next time, you can't hesitate. Do you understand me?" Margaret nodded slowly, her jaw tight with resolve. Down the hall, Bridget stood in the doorway of her room, listening. Her hand tightened around the key at her belt. Winter deepened, and with it the tension in the farmhouse became unbearable. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with the weight of what no one dared to say aloud. Bridget grew quieter, colder. She no longer shouted at Margaret. She didn't need to. Instead, she began to control every detail of her sister's life with quiet precision. Margaret's chores were reassigned so she would never be alone. Her meals were portioned out by Bridget's hand, her trips outside timed and watched. When Margaret lingered too long by the door, Bridget would simply appear, as if summoned by Margaret's very thoughts, and stand there silently until she moved away. It wasn't punishment. It was pressure. The kind that wore a person down, grain by grain, day by day. Catherine saw what was happening and tried to shield Margaret where she could, sneaking her extra food, slipping her warm socks on the coldest nights. But Bridget's eyes were everywhere. One night, Catherine found the money box under Bridget's bed and stole 3 coins. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped them. She hid them in the lining of her shawl, her heart pounding at the sound of Bridget's footsteps on the stairs. When she returned to her room, Margaret was sitting awake, staring out the window into the dark yard. "We'll try again," Catherine whispered, pressing the coins into her sister's palm. "When the next snowstorm comes, no one will see your tracks." Margaret closed her fingers around the coins, her expression grim. "And if Bridget catches me?" Catherine hesitated. "Then I won't let her hurt you. Not this time." Margaret gave her a long, searching look. "Are you willing to fight her for me?" Catherine didn't answer. Across the hall, Bridget sat awake by the dying fire, sharpening Father's old hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel echoed softly through the house, a sound that made Sarah pull the blankets over her head. Bridget wasn't trying to hide it. She wanted them to hear. By January, the Brennan farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a fortress. Bridget began locking the outer doors at night and keeping the keys under her pillow. When Catherine protested, Bridget only smiled and said it was for their protection. "The world is dangerous," she murmured, almost sweetly. "You wouldn't want something to happen to us before our work is done." But Catherine noticed that the windows were suddenly nailed shut. Sarah began counting the loaves of bread in the pantry and noticed that Bridget had started cutting them smaller. The meals were meager now, just enough to keep them alive but not enough to give them strength. Margaret grew pale and thin, her eyes sunken from sleeplessness. She was being broken slowly, methodically, until she would either obey or collapse. Catherine realized Bridget was tightening the noose 1 knot at a time. Then, one night, Bridget tested them. She left the cellar door unlocked, something she never did, and waited to see who would notice. Sarah found it first and ran to tell Catherine, her voice trembling with excitement. This is it. She's finally getting careless. But Catherine's stomach turned cold. No, this wasn't carelessness. This was bait. She told Sarah to wait, to do nothing. They stood silently by the window, and sure enough, an hour later they heard Bridget's slow, deliberate footsteps creaking across the floorboards. The sound of the cellar door closing echoed through the house, followed by the faint click of the lock. She had been watching. Catherine's hands balled into fists. Bridget was no longer just controlling them, she was studying them, probing their weaknesses like a hunter toying with wounded prey. That night, Catherine and Margaret made their decision. There would be no slow escape, no gradual plan. They would either get out or die trying. They whispered by candlelight until dawn, plotting their move. The storm they had prayed for finally came 2 days later, a blizzard that swallowed the farm in white silence. Macabre had tucked the stolen coins into her bodice and kissed Sarah's forehead. "If we don't make it," she whispered, "tell the truth when you can." Sarah grabbed her hand. "Bridget will kill me if I do." Margaret's answer was quiet, but it burned like steel. "She'll kill all of us if we don't." The wind screamed like a living thing that night, howling around the stone walls, rattling the shutters like angry fists. Snow drove sideways, erasing footprints within seconds, swallowing the world in white silence. It was their only chance. Catherine and Margaret moved like ghosts through the house, their breath misting in the frozen air. They dressed in layers, wrapping shawls tight around their heads, and crept toward the back door. Bridget was asleep, or pretending to be. Catherine's fingers trembled as she reached under Bridget's pillow and slid the ring of keys free. Bridget didn't stir, but her breathing sounded too even, too controlled. Every second felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. They reached the back door and unlocked it slowly, praying the storm would cover the creak of the hinges. Outside, the world was a blur of white, the snow blinding under the moonlight. They stepped into the storm. The cold hit them like a wall, cutting through every layer of cloth, freezing their eyelashes together. They stumbled through knee-deep drifts toward the tree line, leaning into the wind that tried to push them back toward the house. Behind them, the farmhouse was a faint, glowing shape, a single light in the upstairs window still burning. "Did she wake up?" Margaret shouted over the wind. Catherine didn't answer. They made it to the edge of the field before it happened. A sound so sharp it cut through the blizzard. The barn door slammed open. A lantern swung wildly in the dark, and a voice called out, "Catherine! Margaret!" Bridget's voice, calm, measured, too calm. Catherine froze, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Margaret grabbed her arm. "We have to keep going." But Erin turned. Through the snow she could see Bridget's silhouette in the barn doorway, the lantern casting her shadow long and terrible against the drifts. "Come back," Bridget said softly, not shouting now, not angry, just certain. For a heartbeat, Catherine almost obeyed. Then Margaret pulled her, hard, and they ran. Bridget's voice followed them into the storm, low, steady, promising. "You can run," she called, "but you will come home. One way or another, you will come home." The snow swallowed everything. Sound, light, even the shape of the world. Catherine and Margaret stumbled blindly across the frozen fields, their legs heavy, their breath tearing at their throats. The storm had turned into a white wall, erasing everything behind them, but also ahead. They could no longer see the tree line. The wind howled so loud that Margaret didn't hear it at first. The faint crunch of footsteps behind them. Then came the lantern light. It bobbed in the distance like a single burning eye, cutting through the blizzard in slow, deliberate arcs. Bridget was coming. "She's following us," Catherine gasped, her voice almost lost in the wind. "She can't track us," Margaret said, but even as she spoke she wasn't sure. Bridget had grown up on this land. She knew every hollow, every fence post, every patch of frozen ground by heart. The sisters veered left, trying to use the storm to their advantage, but the snow fought them with every step. Their skirts were soaked, their boots filling with ice water, their bodies shaking from the cold. Then Margaret fell. Her foot caught on a hidden root under the snow, sending her crashing face first into the drift. Catherine hauled her up, but Margaret's ankle gave a sickening twist. She couldn't run anymore. They limped together toward a line of trees just visible through the whiteout. If they could reach them, they might find shelter in the hollow stump where Catherine used to hide as a child. Behind them, the lantern light drew closer. Then it stopped. The sisters froze, listening, their hearts hammering in the dark. The wind roared, but underneath it, faint, distant, came the sound of a voice. Bridget's voice. She wasn't shouting this time. She was singing. A soft, lilting Irish lullaby their father used to sing when they were small. It carried through the storm like a thread, winding around them, pulling them back toward the light. Margaret's teeth chattered. She's toying with us. No, Catherine whispered, her breath visible in the frozen air. She's telling us she knows exactly where we are. The singing stopped. Then came silence. A silence worse than the storm. The silence was worse than the singing. Catherine and Margaret pressed themselves against the nearest tree, their bodies shaking from more than the cold now. The lantern light had vanished, swallowed by the storm, but they knew Bridget was still out there, somewhere in the white. The wind seemed to carry her presence, like the farm itself was holding its breath. Catherine strained to hear over the roar of the blizzard. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No hint of where Bridget might be. She's waiting, Margaret whispered, her lips barely moving. For what? For us to move first. The realization sank into Catherine's gut like a stone. Bridget didn't need to chase them. She could just wait until the storm did her work for her. If they stayed put, they would freeze to death by morning. Margaret clutched the coins in her bodice. We have to keep going. If we can make it to Miller's Bridge, someone might see us at dawn. That's 1/2 mile, Catherine said, glancing at Margaret's twisted ankle. Then leave me. Catherine grabbed her sister's arm hard enough to make her wince. Don't say that. We're getting out together. A sudden flash of light cut through the storm, the lantern swinging back into view for just a second before it vanished again. Bridget was moving, slowly, deliberately, herding them. She's driving us somewhere, Catherine realized aloud. Margaret's breath caught. Back toward the house. No, Catherine said, staring into the swirling white, her mind racing. Toward the creek. She wants to trap us against the water. The creek was half frozen this time of year, the ice fragile under the weight of snow. If they stumbled into it in the dark, they'd be dead before they could scream. Catherine made a decision. We're going to the old hayshed, she said, her voice shaking but firm. If we can make it there, we can hide until morning. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. They began to move, half dragging, half stumbling, the wind clawing at them like invisible hands. Every few steps, Catherine glanced back, looking for that faint glow of the lantern, but it didn't appear, which meant Bridget had either lost them or was already ahead, waiting in the dark. The hayshed loomed out of the blizzard like a dark shape against the snow, its roof sagging, its door half hanging on rusted hinges. Catherine shoved it open, and the smell of old hay and rot hit her like a wave. They stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them, and for a moment it felt like they had escaped the storm itself. The silence inside was deafening. They collapsed onto the frozen floor, gasping, shaking, their wet clothes steaming faintly in the dimness. Then Catherine saw it. In the corner, half buried under a pile of brittle hay, was the lantern. Still warm. She crawled toward it, her breath catching in her throat. It hadn't been blown here by the storm. It had been placed here. Margaret's eyes widened as the realization hit. She knew we'd come here. Before Catherine could answer, something creaked above them, slow, deliberate. They both looked up. Through a gap in the rafters, a shape moved. The faint line of someone crouched in the loft, perfectly still. Catherine's blood turned to ice. Bridget had been here first. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The storm howled outside, shaking the shed walls, but inside there was only breath. 3 sets of it. Then Bridget spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle. You're freezing, she said softly from above. You'll catch your death if you stay out here. Margaret scrambled backward, her shoulder hitting the door. Bridget's tone didn't change. "I'm not angry. You just need to come back. We can fix this." Catherine's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear herself think. Bridget wasn't shouting. She wasn't threatening. She was coaxing, lulling them, like she was speaking to frightened animals she meant to bring back into a pen. Margaret's hand found Catherine's. "She's not going to let us leave alive," Margaret whispered. The shed creaked again. Bridget shifting her weight in the loft above them, Catherine made a decision. "On 3, she mouthed. Margaret nodded, her eyes wide. Catherine reached for the door latch. Catherine's fingers closed around the latch. 1, she whispered. Above them the rafters groaned as Bridget shifted, her voice still maddeningly calm. "You're only making it worse." 2. Margaret braced herself, clutching the coins so tightly they cut into her palm. 3! Catherine yanked the door open, and the wind screamed inside, nearly tearing it from her hands. Snow blasted into the shed, blinding them both. But it was enough cover. They ran. Behind them came a sound like thunder. Bridget dropping from the loft. The crash of boots hitting the floor echoed through the storm, followed by the unmistakable scrape of steel leaving its sheath. She had brought Father's hunting knife. The sisters stumbled into the blizzard, their skirts whipping around their legs, their lungs burning. Catherine pulled Margaret toward the tree line, but Bridget was already in the snow behind them, her shadow lows, and terrible, in the lantern's glow. "Stop!" Bridget shouted, her voice sharp now, cutting through the wind. "You're going to die out here." Catherine didn't look back. "Better than dying in that house," she screamed, though the wind nearly stole the words. Bridget was faster, stronger. She gained on them with terrifying speed, the lantern swinging wildly from her belt, its light flashing across the snow like a heartbeat. Margaret slipped again, her ankle twisting worse this time, and she went down hard. Catherine dropped beside her, trying to haul her up, but Bridget was already there. A dark figure in the whiteout, the knife glinting in her hand. For a moment everything stopped. The 3 sisters stared at one another, the wind shrieking around them. Snow stung their faces like needles. "Come back," Bridget said, her chest heaving. "This ends now." "No," Catherine said, stepping between Bridget and Margaret. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were steady. "It ends tonight, but not the way you think." Bridget lunged. Catherine grabbed a broken tree branch from the snow and swung. The branch cracked against Bridget's arm, and the knife flew from her hand, vanishing into the drifts. Bridget roared, more beast than woman now, and hurled herself at Catherine. They hit the ground together, the snow cushioning the impact but stealing the breath from Catherine's lungs. Margaret scrambled toward the fallen knife. Margaret's fingers closed around the knife hilt. It was ice cold, slick with snow, heavier than she remembered. For a split second she froze, the storm raging around her. Catherine and Bridget locked together in the drifts, grunting, clawing, each trying to overpower the other. "Margaret!" Catherine's voice was hoarse, desperate. Bridget had Catherine pinned, her hands forcing her sister's face into the snow. Catherine kicked wildly, but Bridget was stronger, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes blazing with something far beyond anger. Margaret staggered to her feet, knife in hand. She could end this. She could save Catherine. But in that same moment, Bridget looked up at her. Not with rage now, but with something softer. Pleading. "Don't," Bridget choked out. "I did all of this for us. For you." The wind howled around them, erasing all sound but her voice. Margaret's mind flashed with every memory. Bridget's cold hands guiding hers as a child. Bridget's voice singing her to sleep when their mother died. Bridget's unbending will that had kept the farm alive when everything else fell apart. Then she saw Catherine's face, turning purple under Bridget's grip. The choice was no longer a choice. Margaret lunged. The knife sank deep into Bridget's shoulder, hot blood steaming in the freezing air. Bridget screamed, her grip on Catherine breaking. Catherine scrambled free, shoving her sister off and pulling Margaret back toward the trees. Bridget fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the wound. For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then she began to laugh low at first, then louder, rising above the storm like something unholy. "You think this changes anything?" she shouted after them, blood streaking her sleeve. "You think you can run far enough? You are mine, both of you, and I will find you." Catherine dragged Margaret into the dark woods, not daring to look back. Behind them, Bridget's laughter echoed, carried on the wind, chasing them through the trees until it was impossible to tell if it was real or just in their heads. The blizzard broke just before dawn. The wind fell silent, leaving behind a world transformed, the farm buried under a shroud of white, every fence post and tree limb softened, as though nothing violent had ever happened here. Catherine and Margaret stumbled out of the woods hours later, half frozen, soaked to the bone, their faces raw from the wind. Margaret leaned heavily on Catherine, each step a battle against the pain in her ankle. In the distance, they saw the road. Smoke curled from a chimney. The Miller farm. Salvation. For a moment, the sisters just stood there, clinging to each other, staring at the faint line of smoke against the pale pink sky. They were alive. But Catherine felt no relief, because somewhere behind them, hidden in the white silence of the farm, Bridget was still alive too. They heard no pursuit, no shouts, no crack of a gunshot, but as Catherine glanced back toward the trees, she swore she saw a single dark figure standing far in the distance, motionless against the snow. Margaret saw it too. "She's still watching us," she whispered. "Then keep walking," Catherine said, her voice like iron. They limped toward the Miller farm, leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the snow. With every step, Catherine's resolve hardened. They would not go back. They would not let Bridget drag them into that house again, but the thought twisted in her chest like a knife. Bridget would not stop. Even if she bled out, even if she froze to death in the snow, Bridget's shadow would hang over them forever. When they reached the farmhouse, Mrs. Miller gasped at the sight of them, hauling them inside, stripping off their wet clothes, wrapping them in blankets. Catherine barely felt the warmth. She sat in silence by the fire, staring into the flames, Margaret dozing fitfully beside her. In the crackle of the firewood, she swore she heard it again. That low, ragged laugh. It wasn't possible. Bridget was miles away. And yet, the sound seemed to curl around her, a reminder that the battle was not over, only postponed. Morning had come, but the nightmare had followed them into the light. By midday, the whole Miller farm knew what had happened, or at least the story Catherine was willing to tell. "She's gone mad," Catherine said flatly, staring at the floor as Mrs. Miller wrapped Margaret's ankle. "She locked us in, tried to starve us. We had to run." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. Mr. Miller saddled a horse and rode toward town, promising to bring the sheriff. Catherine watched him disappear down the snowy road, her stomach tight. If the sheriff came, there would be questions. There would be a search party. They would find Bridget, bleeding, wounded but alive. And then what? Would Bridget tell the truth? Would she tell about the deaths, about the poison, about the quiet, careful years of murder that had kept the farm whole? Would she tell that Catherine had been there every step of the way, even if she hadn't always agreed? Catherine felt a cold worse than the blizzard settle into her bones. Margaret stirred, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "We have to be ready," she whispered, "when they bring her back." "They might not bring her back," Catherine said, though even as she spoke, she didn't believe it. Bridget was too strong, too clever. She would survive, and when she did, she would tell her story. Catherine paced the small kitchen, every sound outside making her flinch. The creak of the barn door, the bark of the Miller dog, each one could be Bridget's footsteps in the snow. Night fell again, the storm gone, the sky cruelly clear. The sheriff still hadn't returned. Catherine stood at the window, staring at the line of trees where the forest met the fields. And then she saw it. A single lantern glow, far away near the edge of the woods. Too far to be a neighbor, too deliberate to be an accident. Catherine's heart slammed against her ribs. "She's coming," she whispered. Margaret struggled to sit up, wincing with pain. "Then we can't wait for the sheriff." Catherine turned from the window, her shadow stretched long across the floor. "No," she said. "This ends tonight, one way or another." The house was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. Catherine moved through it like a ghost, collecting what she needed. The old shotgun above, the hearth, 2 shells she found in a drawer, a heavy iron poker from beside the stove. Margaret watched her, her face pale but her jaw set. "You're serious," she said. Catherine nodded. "We can't run again. If she comes, we finish it." The sisters worked quickly. Catherine shuttered the windows, darkening the kitchen until only the glow from the stove lit their faces. Margaret dragged a chair to the far wall, wedging it under the door handle to slow anyone who tried to force it open. Then they waited. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Every creak of the house made Catherine's hands tighten on the shotgun. Every gust of wind outside sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow. At last, there came a knock. Not frantic, not polite. 3 slow, measured raps against the door. Margaret's eyes went wide. "It's her." "Stay back," Catherine hissed, raising the shotgun. The knock came again. Then Bridget's voice, calm, quiet, almost tender. "Let me in, Catherine. We don't have to end it this way." Catherine's finger hovered over the trigger. "You tried to kill us," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "No," Bridget said softly through the wood. "I tried to keep you safe. You don't understand yet, but you will. Everything I've done, I did for you." Margaret took the poker in both hands, stepping closer to Catherine. "Don't listen," she whispered. "She's trying to get inside your head." Outside, Bridget laughed, low, throaty, the same laugh that had followed them through the storm. "You think you can stop me?" she called. "You think you can put me down like a rabid dog? I am your blood, Catherine. You can shoot me dead, but you'll never be rid of me." The sound of her footsteps crunched in the snow, circling the house. "She's looking for another way in," Catherine breathed. Margaret gripped the poker so hard her knuckles turned white. "Then we make sure she doesn't find one." The sisters took their positions, Catherine by the door, Margaret near the back window, their breath shallow, every muscle tense. The final night had begun. The first sound was glass shattering. Margaret spun just in time to see the back window burst inward, snow and shards raining across the floor. Bridget's arm came through first, gripping the sill, hauling herself inside with terrifying strength. "Now!" Catherine shouted. The shotgun roared, deafening in the small kitchen. The blast hit the wall inches from Bridget's head, splintering wood, filling the room with smoke. Bridget didn't flinch. She dropped into the kitchen like a predator, eyes blazing, blood still dried on her shoulder from the night before. "You missed," she said, her voice low and savage. Catherine fumbled to reload, but Bridget was already moving. She kicked the shotgun from Catherine's hands, sending it skidding across the floor. Margaret swung the iron poker with all her strength. It connected with Bridget's side, the sound sickening, but Bridget didn't go down. She grabbed the poker, yanked it free, and hurled Margaret against the table. The room became chaos. Catherine lunged for the shotgun while Bridget turned on Margaret, pinning her down, her hands around her throat. "You're weak," Bridget snarled, her face inches from her sister's. "You'd have sold us all for a warm bed and a quiet life." Margaret clawed at her, gasping for air. Catherine grabbed the shotgun, snapped it closed with trembling hands. "Bridget!" she shouted. Bridget looked up, just as Catherine pulled the trigger. The blast threw Bridget backward into the wall, her body crumpling, the lantern on the table toppling and shattering, spilling fire across the floor. Flames leapt to the curtains, the dry wood catching like kindling. Catherine and Margaret stared at Bridget's motionless body, the room filling with smoke, the heat already unbearable. "Go!" Catherine shouted, dragging Margaret toward the door. They stumbled out into the freezing night, coughing, their faces streaked with soot. Behind them, the farmhouse burned, flames devouring the walls, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. For a moment the sisters stood together in the snow, watching their childhood home, and everything that had happened inside it, turn to ash. Then came a sound. A ragged, broken cough from inside the burning house. Catherine's blood ran cold. "She's still alive," Margaret whispered. And then, laughter. Weak, but unmistakable. The laughter didn't stop. Through the roar of the fire, through the crackle of collapsing beams, Bridget's voice came, hoarse, almost inhuman, yet filled with terrible joy. "You think this ends with me?" she screamed. The sisters froze in the snow. Margaret clutched Catherine's arm, her entire body trembling. The fire lit Bridget's silhouette for one last moment, standing in the flames, arms outstretched as if she were welcoming death like an old friend. "You are me," she cried, her voice carrying over the wind. "You are all me." And then the roof came down. The fire swallowed her whole. The night went still. Margaret fell to her knees sobbing while Catherine stood motionless, her face blank, illuminated by the inferno. When morning came, there was nothing left of the farmhouse but blackened stone and smoking ash. The bodies of Bridget and Sarah were found side by side, fused together in death, unrecognizable but unmistakably locked in an embrace. Catherine and Margaret did not speak to each other for 3 days. When they finally did, it was over the sound of hammers, rebuilding the barn first, then the house. The land had to be worked, the fences mended, the animals fed. By spring, the farm was thriving again. The Brennan name was whispered about in Lancaster County, but no one dared say what they truly believed. That 2 of the sisters had burned alive because of what they had done, and that the 2 who remained a curse to carry the blood-stained legacy forever. Margaret never married again. Catherine became the undisputed head of the family, her hair turning white before her 35th.